Hello, and welcome to Mending with Gold, the Kintsugi Therapist Collective podcast. Kintsugi Therapist Collective, or KTC, is a virtual community for therapists and aligned care workers dedicated to building embodied and liberatory practices of care. Each guest is invited to explore three aspects of Kintsugi as a metaphor for mending a place of brokenness in their life. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing pottery with lacquer and precious metals. By emphasizing rather than hiding what is broken, the whole experience of the object is honored. Infused with the ethos of KTC, Mending with Gold is a space to connect and explore the reality that there is strength, beauty, and value in the brokenness that is intrinsic to being human. For the care workers tuning in, active enrollment for our spring 2025 embodied private practice cohort is taking place now. We also have a small number of openings in several other programs, including Barriers to Nourishment, the BIPOC Case Consultation Group, Fertility, Queerness, and Care Work, and the Mixed Identity Clinical Alliance. To read more about all of our program offerings, please visit www.kintsugitherapistcollective.com/offerings. Today we welcome Reverend Syd Yang to the podcast. Reverend Syd Yang is a mixed-race Taiwanese American, queer, trans, non-binary, lay Buddhist minister and spiritual counselor who engages decolonial possibilities for shared liberation through their practice, Blue Jaguar Healing Arts. Syd is also a certified Movement Chaplain through Faith Matters Network. Syd's work finds its resonance in the stories we each hold at the intersection of memory, body, sexuality, and mental health. Syd works primarily with queer and trans BIPOC individuals, as well as regularly leads workshops and facilitates community-based practice spaces for well-being and healing justice, with a specific focus on grief, healing ancestral trauma, sexuality and spirituality, body liberation, and recovery. Syd recently co-founded the Throughline Collective, a spiritually expansive and anti-carceral trauma care practice rooted in Buddhist teaching.
Hi, Syd. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. So we've got some sort of big questions, and we can sort of take it in any direction that feels resonant for you. But the first question is about a break, like some kind of break in your life. And if you want to kind of also, consider what you think the break is sort of rooted in or where it came from, you can share that too. But yeah, anywhere you want to take that.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I've been sitting with that question of what is the break that wants to be talked about or acknowledged. And the one I didn't want to talk about is the one that is like, but I'm right here, let's talk. Oh. And so here we are. And I think there's probably an imperfectness or an incompleteness to where I am with this break. But it is, it feels like the break that takes up so much space still, or has taken up so much space in my life. And it's the break with my parents when I formally and completely said, zero contact, no more talking, no more relationship, no contact. And that was a process between 2018, where I did that with my mom in a conversation, and 2019 with my father in a conversation. And they're still married. And so they're in it, together in a relationship. And it was just this thing or this decision that happened for me that I think was in a long time coming, but one that I was like, but no, I can make this work. I can get them to like see me, or I can get them to accept me. I can make this work, right? It's supposed to work. I'm supposed to have an amicable, somewhat relationship with my parents, even if there's harm that's been done, even if there's wounding that's been done, even if there's abuse that's happened. And I was like so committed to this, like it can work. Like I'm not a good Buddhist if I can't love my parents in a way and be in a amicable, loving, compassionate relationship with them, which means like I go to like family events and I call them and I check in on them and I have this like, warmth in my heart for them. And I couldn't make that happen. like my strong arming it, right, to happen. And a couple of things happened in my relationships with them where things were said and kind of their beliefs about me like came to light in a way that I was like, oh, that's really hurtful in a way that I actually can't change that perspective at all. And I don't want to keep hitting up against it because I'm constantly, it's like stepping into like a room that's like shards of glass are being thrown at me all the time. And I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? And I don't have to do that. And so the break was saying, I'm choosing not to have a relationship with you. And I'm not going to respond to your texts. And I'm not going to call you. And I'm not going to have dialogue with you. I am pulling myself, fully separating. And it was really hard. And what I experienced on the like after doing that was this like spaciousness of, oh, I can breathe. Like there's like, oh, I have space to like make my own decisions and like make choices that aren't constantly with this voice of what would your parents think? How is that going to impact your parents? Is that going to change your ability to be in relationship with them? And like by taking all of that out, there was this like space to be like, well, then who am I? And who do I want to be in the world? And how do I get to be in the world? And what do I want? And like that question that has been like what do I want has been like almost like a spiritual practice since then of like, I don't think I've ever asked myself that question in a really concerted way of like, what do I want? Yeah, okay, I want this kind of ice cream versus that kind of ice cream. But like, what do I want in terms of how do I want to live my life? What are the relationships I want to be building? How do I want to be a full person in their own integrity in the world? What does that look like? And like not being in contact with my parents and kind of not feeling it, like having cut off that obligation for myself, gave me this space to be like, oh, there's a lot more possibilities here than I realized were there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like what? What kind of possibilities have you?
That's a good question. Like I could make decisions about like, okay. So one of the things that I think there was always this hiding my Buddhism or hiding my practice of Buddhism because my parents were very like they're evangelical Christians who, even though my dad's Taiwanese and parts of our family are Buddhist, he was like, Buddhism is bad. Like it's not, it's bad. It's not good. And so I had to hide that part, I think, a lot of my life around that. And so I was noticing in that once there was that space, I was like, why do I have shame around this? Why am I hiding this? Why am I almost apologetic in spaces of like, oh yeah, I'm a Buddhist, or oh yeah, this, or not even bringing it up. And like that space to finally be like, oh, but this is my practice. This is where I'm finding spiritual home. This is where I'm finding religious meaning, existential meaning. eventually like led to the space around like, I want to go deeper with this, and did a Buddhist MDiv, which then like, I was like, oh, I get to choose this. And in choosing that, there was this like knowing in my body of like, oh, this is what I've wanted for so long, but never felt like I had permission, right? Or I was allowed to have what I wanted because of the ways that it was in opposition to my parents or their belief systems. And so that break gave me that space to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely sounds like your practice is a big part of what has supported you in like maintaining this break or maintaining a kind of commitment to yourself around this. Do you feel like there are other kind of components to that have been supporting you in, I don't know if the challenge for you is really maintaining the kind of break, but maybe maintaining something about like uh solidarity with yourself, or kind of staying with yourself in a way.
Yeah, I think, meditation and contemplative practices have been so supportive of me in the ways that I sit, the ways that I'm with myself and my desire and my knowing.
Mm.
And what was interesting over the last, because this was 2018, 2019, so we're like 5 years, 6 years later, right? Of what has evolved over that is recognizing that decision to break and kind of cut off and separate and sever, right, with my parents was starting to take up that same amount of space that before it was this like, how do I fix this relationship? And now I'm like, oh, I have to like hold on to it and like resist it. And I was like, oh, there's all this resistance that to maintain that break in a certain way. And so I was noticing that in my sitting, I was noticing that in just my practices of being with myself. And then two things happened that kind of, I think, broke the break, or like, or a break to the break, right? And really opened me up to this idea of like, what if a form of repair is possible? But I didn't know what that was. I was like, well, let me just go. And so this one day, I was just in a lot of feelings. I had just gotten an email from my mom had sent out this email to like all the kids in the family, and my dad had been diagnosed with dementia. And I was like, oh, I have feelings about this. They're uncomfortable feelings. I don't like these feelings. I don't know what these feelings are. I don't want to sit with them. And so that was the first thing that happened. And then my response to that was like, I'm going to go for a really long and hard run. And so I went for this run. And somehow I thought it would be wise. I like put on my headphones, looked at podcasts. I was like, podcast about adult child and parent estrangement. Let me listen to those podcasts. And I just picked one by random. And I'm listening to this woman who runs this podcast. And she's talking about how she used to be estranged from her mother, and her daughter was then estranged from her adult daughter, and like talking about kind of the lessons and learning she'd gotten over the years of doing this, having conversations with parents and children, adult children. And it was fascinating. And at the end of it, there's one thing she said. She said, for the parents who are listening, this is what's important. If the relationship is going to change, you have to do your work. It is not on the shoulders of the children to do your work for you. And I've never quite heard that before. And it made me realize in that moment how much I have been holding, like, if anything's going to change in this relationship with my parents, I have to do all the work. I have to fix me. I have to figure out how to be free or find the peace in being with them and the ways that they speak to me and the ways that they have treated me. And it was like this opening of like, okay, here's this reality. My dad has dementia. Here's this possibility that what if I don't have to do all the work? And it was like this, those two things coming together created this like almost new space for me to be, well, what could repair look like? And do I want it? And I began to start to realize like, oh, I always thought I was supposed to have this certain type of relationship. Like my relationship with my parents was supposed to look a certain way. Like we were supposed to be friendly. I'm supposed to care for them. I'm supposed to want to be around them and go visit them and like ask how they're doing and like genuinely care about them in a very external and expressive way. And I realized I'm like, oh, I don't want that anymore. What I want is how do I actually find repair or find a shape where I can have real spaciousness, where I'm not actually in resistance anymore to, oh, are they going to text me again? Or what happens if I have to do this or have to go see them? And that happened, right? So here's my dad getting diagnosed with dementia. And that was that question of, well, then what do I want to do? And, my siblings were like, are you going to talk to dad? Are you going to go see dad? And I'm like, friends were like, oh, my dad had dementia and it just healed our relationship. It was so great. Mm-hmm. I was like, yeah. Okay. All of these like external expectations. And so I just sat and I actually just sat with it for a year and realized in that sitting and that quietness is if I go at my own pace, the messages and the knowing has space to emerge. And I was like, oh, I do actually want to see my dad again. And it took me a while to kind of pull apart what is my expectation around that, and to disengage from what they're going to think this expectation is. If I call them and say, I want to see you, it's like, oh, they're coming back. They're coming back. They want to be a part of the family. And that's not what was happening. And I was like, had to let go of like, they can have their own expectations and I can actually sit in my knowing of what I need and what I want. And so I think that was a huge turning point. And that was this last year. And so I did go visit them in July of this last year. And it was so hard. It was so hard. And it was also so liberating in this way that it helped me understand that like I get to make choices based on what I need and want. And my going to see them wasn't actually about them. It was about me. And that was wild to own that. And realizing all these messages and stories and cultural messages around like, how do you be the good child or the good, in Chinese and Taiwanese culture, the children are supposed to care for their, parents as they get older. I'm not doing that. And so like, there's also like hitting up against those stories and messages and expectations and being like, what if I don't have to? What if that's why I have siblings? Because they get to do that and I don't have to do that, right? And that can actually be a shape of a relationship that works for me. And I think that what's come out of that is, and this is where I feel like things are still in this like imperfect or like emergent state, is what is the shape of that relationship? What does the relationship between my parents and I, which isn't what they want or what I want, but it's that entity that forms and is formed because we exist in relation to each other. What is the shape that needs to be in order for me to feel free, for them to feel free? And what if that shape is actually still no contact? And that's where I'm kind of in this place of like, oh, I didn't think that that would be a possibility.
Mm.
And so like there's this thing that this image I've been thinking about in, contemplating this conversation is when something breaks, when we put it back together, even with the gold or even with um, maybe a piece gets missing, like it's actually something entirely new. And that it maybe looks like the same shape. Maybe a bowl is still a bowl and the container may have the same purpose, but it's actually something entirely different. And there's this invitation to redefine or repurpose what gets created when repair happens. And what if repair can happen without both sides of that break, like me and my parents? Like I can do the repair and it can still be a whole container without them coming in and doing an apology and making an acknowledgement and like, naming their role and their part in this and doing their work, like the woman said on the podcast, right? And I think like before this, I felt like repair had to involve this, like both parties had to come in and have this deep restorative conversation. But the form of the container can still be rebuilt. And that's what I'm exploring now is like, oh, I get to define and repurpose and repair this container. And it's feeling really almost functional in a new way. And it's like, this is where I feel like I don't have words. I'm like, oh, this is the I don't know that I don't know. I didn't know that this was possible. But this is the work, right? Like, like this is like being with the possibilities of what can be or what might be, or what feels impossible, and just continuing to lean into my spiritual practices and lean into the possibility that freedom is possible or liberation is possible or spaciousness within one's own experience is possible. And like, what if this, like for me, like what might be possible in all of my relationships if I ask the question, not what do I want this relationship to be, but what is this relationship wanting to be or needing to be? What is the shape that is the most liberating for me and the other person, or me and the other, who all is involved in that relationship, versus what is it? What is it needing? What is it? What do I have to like do in order to make it this thing or this shape, or like what I want it to be or what I think it's supposed to be? And so that's where it feels like this profound shift is happening for me, and this understanding or deeper appreciation that like breaks and ruptures are actually required for growth and evolution to happen, or for transformation to happen. And noticing where I try to resist rupture or think like if a rupture or break is happening, something is wrong. And what if that break that I had with my parents was actually the most liberating step that needed to happen for me to grow, for them to grow, for the relationship to grow? And it wasn't that something was wrong or I was wrong. And I think shifting that narrative around how we talk about like estrangement or parental estrangement, or like how we are separated from our parents or adult children, is like, what if that is a liberating choice and actually what is needed for growth and healing to happen? And I would love to hear like more narratives around that. I think there's still a lot of complicated discourse around, well, something was wrong, so this needed to happen, or there's something that can't be fixed, or we have to, there's a certain form that parental child relationships need to look like, or that this needs to be your goal. Yeah, so I'm sitting with that.
Yeah. Right. I really resonate with this idea of the shape. Like, what is the shape that not what is the shape that should happen, but the fact that a kind of estrangement can be seen not as entirely broken, like a bunch of pieces, just falling on the floor, but that there's a shape to that. That is a relationship. There is a shape to that. And within that, one thing I'm really struck by is, and maybe this is a small thing, but it is when you said that you chose to see your father. It was for you. It wasn't just a choice. It was something for you. And I think that feels like a very insightful insight, I guess, but also something that that does speak, I think, to like a liberating aspect of what you're experiencing. And um certainly you've come into contact with the idea of choice, right? And many choices, but to choose to do something that maybe you should have done, or whatever, but that you were relating to it as something that was actually for you.
Yeah.
And yeah, it that feels very powerful to me for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, yeah, it was definitely a choice. Um, I think what's coming up as we're talking is like remembering that moment of like, I'm choosing this. This is for me. And also realizing there was a choice in there of like, there's also ancestral obligation that I was feeling in that too.
Mm.
And that was really around healing generations and intergenerational trauma and wounding, and like realizing that like there's a piece that I held in making that choice to like see my parents and redefine what repair could be for me, was also making a different choice for my lineage and the ancestors before me. And like there was this moment as I was going to see them, I was driving, they live in Ohio, and I was driving from where I was staying to their house. And as I was driving, one of my grandmothers showed up, my dad's birth mom showed up in the car with me, and she's like, "You need to tell him that I love him." And I was like, ah. And I just started bawling. And I was like, I can't hold this obligation. I can't have this responsibility of telling like my dad that you loved him. And, then my grandmother that my dad was raised by, who was really abusive to him, also showed up, and she's like, "You need to tell him that I'm sorry." And I'm like, oh my God, like, you can come with me, but you can't, like this, that there was also this moment for me of like, in that choice, I was also choosing with my ancestors to be like, you can be with me, but I'm not going to do your work.
Mm.
You can be with me, we can do this together, but I'm not going to do your work for you. And that was this huge moment of like, oh, what if I'm not just a pawn in my own family system, but I'm actually have agency in the dynamics, I have agency in the relationships, I have agency in the shape of what needs to or wants to emerge or to form, both with my ancestors, with my parents, and like with that lineage. And that was also a moment of like choice of like, oh, I get to participate in this, not just be told what to do or like be in like this deference to other people's needs and desires. Yeah, it was huge. It's
Yeah.
it's still processing. Um, yeah.
Right. That intergenerational imperative that we sometimes don't even, I think a lot of times we don't realize that we are acting from a place of, obedience to these, intergenerational forces or unresolved trauma that kind of we can't really see clearly. It's cool. You saw it really clearly. It was like right there, and but a lot of times we can't, it's very challenging to understand that we're acting from that kind of place of, you know, again, wanting to repair that intergenerational trauma in a particular way, in a kind of neat and tidy, like sometimes I think about, the phrase like cycle breakers or, people who, and I think I'm one of those people, I think, and I certainly are one of those people. And yet this conversation is just making me think about what that actually can look like and the pressure that we put on ourselves to break cycles by essentially being completely healed, not troubled individuals who really like just pull ourselves together. I mean, it's just so much pressure, right? And there's something that, I think in what you're describing that you continually are sort of checking in about how much pressure you're putting on yourself to do or make, the grasping and the, efforting, and allowing something, as you described it, allowing something that's kind of uncanny or unknown to emerge. It's not something you're, it's not something you can predict, and it's also not something that you can fully control.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to even just the metaphor of the conversation and this podcast, right, of Kintsugi, is like the break doesn't disappear. It's still there. It's still visible. It's still that. And so like I think about how the break with my parents and the shape now, it still may look the same. Like that break is still very visible. But it's not like it's a choice now and a shape that is functional versus a moment of like resistance and defiance and like last resort, like I have to do something has to change. Like that energy isn't present anymore. Now it can be like, oh, the break looks the same. And it feels entirely different in my body and the ways that it's impacting, and being able to shift the other relationships I have in my life, because I'm not bringing that energy of resistance or fighting against, right? Like I have to fight against this thing in order for this other thing to exist.
Yeah. That's cool. I like hearing that. That energy sounds really so much is just more preferable for sure, but a hard one kind of journey to that place. I really appreciate you sharing this. I think I just would imagine there are so many people who might listen and as a therapist, I know this to be true, that these various forms of kind of estrangement or separation can really end up in locked in energy, like that just never shifts and changes over time. And it's no one's fault. It's just, I think that it's an understandable reaction to something so awful. But I like the metaphor you're offering us. I like the story. I like hearing about your process, and I appreciate you sharing with us.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate this opportunity and the metaphor also of the break and repair, because it gave also me a container, right, to sit with this in a way that like, oh, I can hold it differently, and that like what's emerging actually has been given the opportunity to take shape in a way that feels really resonant and alive. Yeah, very alive. So thank you for that.
Well, it's great talking to you. I hope we can do this again.
Love you guys. I love being in conversation with you all the time.
Me too.